Congresswoman Ilhan Omar initiated the conversation, her tone dripping with the rehearsed contempt she saved specifically for the occupant of the resolute desk. I use that title quite liberally, and I fail to understand what petty power dynamic you believe you are orchestrating by demanding my presence here. But let me be absolutely explicit. She stood with an air of pride, arms folded across her chest, having rejected the seat presented by a Secret Service operative. This was her platform, and she planned to command it fully. I am not resembling one of your frightened little Republican lawmakers who bow to your authority. I stand for genuine citizens and authentic Americans, rather than your wealthy associates and cronies from Mar-a-Lago. Her vocal projection was a tool sharpened through hundreds of cable television interviews and widely shared speeches on the House floor. She was not merely addressing Trump. She was signaling to her millions of devotees, the Squad and the whole progressive coalition that regarded her as a brave figure resisting a fascist wave. It was January the 28th, 2025, barely a week into Trump's second presidential term. The Oval Office was illuminated by the chill, stark light of a winter afternoon, yet the mood within was far from radiant. This did not resemble a standard congressional gathering, as there were no aides recording minutes, no photographers preserving the instant for history, and no press corps hovering just beyond the doors. The chamber was strangely empty of its typical activity. There was only Trump, resting quietly behind the enormous oak desk, and two senior officials positioned to the side. FBI Director Christopher Wray was grasping a pile of dense manila folders, while DHS Secretary Kristi Noem held her own set of documents. Two Secret Service agents remained motionless like sculptures near the exits. The atmosphere felt medical and sanitized, resembling a surgical theater prior to an operation. Omar had been called in that morning by White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. The notification was concise and official, stating that the president required Representative Omar's attendance at the Oval Office at 3 p.m. for a critical national security issue. There were no specifics and no clarifications, merely a demand for her appearance. However, Omar believed she understood exactly what this situation entailed. She assumed Trump, the loudmouthed tyrant, was attempting to frighten her regarding her increasingly loud condemnation of Israel, her demands to reduce military support, and her persistent critiques of his administration's international strategy. She had arrived ready for a conflict. She had tipped off sympathetic media associates, guaranteeing that cameras would be positioned outside to record her rebellious departure. She had practiced her dialogue, intending to demonstrate to her followers that she could confront the prejudiced authoritarian president and emerge triumphant. Now she stood within the Oval Office, certain she possessed the advantage. She trusted that her media visibility shielded her and that her position as a prominent woman of color rendered her invincible. She reasoned that Trump was simply another elderly, irate male she could overpower with virtuous anger, just as she had overpowered every other political rival throughout her career. She possessed absolutely no concept of what was about to transpire. And honestly, she proceeded, her volume increasing with every allegation, an old man facing 91 felony charges who struggles to put together a logical sentence and who provoked a rebellion against his own nation likely should not be preaching to anyone about anything. Therefore, if this gathering concerns my remarks regarding Palestine or about identifying Israel's apartheid system, you can take your fabricated indignation and— "You are finished!" President Trump's voice cut her off, not with a yell but with a hushed, nearly uninterested inquiry. He watched calmly from behind his desk, appearing neither enraged nor even especially irritated. He simply sat there wearing a faint, unreadable smirk, as if observing a mildly amusing television program that was beginning to drag on. Omar was briefly unsettled. This was not the response she had anticipated. Where was the crimson-faced fury? And where was the defensive tirade? "No, I am not finished," she retorted, attempting to reclaim the momentum. "You wish to discuss national security, but you represent the actual national security danger. You are a bigot who prohibited Muslims from coming into this nation, and you are a fascist who places minors in cages. You represent everything incorrect with America packaged in an inexpensive suit and a terrible spray tan. She bent forward, planting her hands upon the rim of the resolute desk, her physical posture hostile and combative. Do you believe you can hush me? I possess millions of supporters, and I have CNN and MSNBC and every significant progressive institution protecting me. You are a frail old man pretending to be a tough guy because that is all you understand how to do. Your own party hardly endures you. Half your cabinet believes you are losing your intellect, and you wish to threaten me? Trump still did not respond. He merely observed her, that identical faint grin lingering on his mouth. Omar's voice started to tremble, the rage blending with a spark of authentic bewilderment. I am not afraid of you, for I have confronted worse than you. I escaped a civil war, and I arrived in this nation with 0 possessions. I have been singled out by bigots my entire existence. You are merely another tyrant who believes his authority renders him powerful, but you are 0. You are a miserable old man who— Sit down! Trump's voice abruptly sliced through her tirade. It was not loud, nor was it wrathful, but it was chilly and final. It was the voice of a man who had managed billion-dollar enterprises and was not soliciting cooperation. Omar stopped in the middle of a phrase, the words perishing in her throat. Something regarding his pitch, the pure undeniable authority of it, caused her to pause. I said sit down, Trump stated again, his tone still placid but bearing a hidden rim of steel. Because what I am prepared to show you is going to alter your whole existence, and you will wish to be seated when you listen to it. For the initial time since walking into the room, Omar experienced a spark of real doubt. This was not unfolding like the political drama she had imagined. Trump ought to have been shouting back at her at this point. Slowly and hesitantly, she lowered herself into the seat opposite his desk, her self-assurance beginning to wobble just a bit. Trump leaned in, his countenance shifting as the faint smile vanished, replaced by something frigid, more grave, and nearly predatory. You believe you are here due to your Palestine remarks, he stated softly. You believe I give a damn regarding your tweets. I do not care what you speak about Israel. I do not care about your rallies. And I do not care about your interviews with CNN. You are present because, for the previous 6 months, the FBI has been probing you for terrorism funding and immigration deceit. He shoved one of the dense binders across the glossy surface of the desk in her direction. The noise of the paper gliding against the timber felt terribly loud in the quiet chamber. And this morning, I declassified the entirety of it. Omar felt her blood turn icy as she gazed at the binder like it was a poisonous viper coiled on the desk. Trump proceeded, his voice factual and nearly conversational. Your brother-in-law in Mogadishu, Ahmed Noor, is an al-Shabaab financier. The Treasury designated his money transfer company as a terrorism financing entity. And the funds you have been wiring to him, totaling $78,000 over 3 years, go straight to terrorists. Omar's mouth became arid. I do not know what your citizenship, she stuttered. But Trump interrupted her, disregarding her attempted disruption. Obtained via fraud, he stated flatly. You asserted your mother perished in Somalia, but she is alive and residing in London. We possess passport logs of you visiting her. You claimed you arrived as a refugee escaping violence? You utilized a fake family surname to qualify for refugee standing. You perpetrated immigration fraud to get here. He reclined in his seat, observing the color vanish from her visage. So here is what is going to occur, Trump said, presenting the conditions of her defeat. You have 72 hours to step down from Congress and depart the United States voluntarily. You will renounce your fraudulent citizenship, get on an airplane, and go back to Somalia or London to reside with your deceased mother, or wherever else will accept you. You do that, and all of this remains quiet. You can frame your resignation however you desire, citing health reasons, family reasons, or whatever narrative you wish to recount. He paused, allowing the proposal to hang in the atmosphere for a long, torturous instant. Or, he continued, his pitch falling lower, you refuse, and tomorrow morning I conduct a press briefing in the Rose Garden. I declassify every individual page of this inquiry, including the terrorism financing, the immigration fraud, and the FBI watch list you have been on since 2018. I sign an executive order commencing denaturalization proceedings on national security foundations. DHS arrests you, and you get detained while you battle it in court for the subsequent 2 years. You will lose because the proof is overpowering. Your citizenship gets revoked, and then ICE deports you to Somalia publicly with every camera on the globe watching. Trump's voice became quieter and more intimate. Easy method or hard method, the choice is yours. You have got 72 hours. Omar sat paralyzed, her mind unable to compute the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding in front of her. This could not be authentic. This had to be a bluff or some type of complex intimidation strategy. You cannot do this, she finally murmured, her voice thin and stressed. This is unconstitutional, as you cannot simply strip a member of Congress. Director Wray, Trump said, not removing his eyes from Omar. Show her what we possess so she comprehends this is not a bluff. FBI Director Christopher Wray stepped ahead, opening one of his binders with the systematic precision of a career law enforcement officer. His expression was entirely neutral and professional. This was merely evidence to him. As Wray began laying out 6 months of investigation, the wire transfers, the surveillance photos, the birth certificates, and the marriage records, Omar realized with a growing horror that this was not a bluff at all. This was genuine, and her entire existence was about to be demolished. To comprehend how we arrived here, and how the confident and defiant congresswoman who had entered the Oval Office ready for a political fistfight ended up facing deportation, you have to go back 4 hours earlier to a time when Ilhan Omar still believed she was untouchable. Director Wray did not require a podium. His quiet and clinical delivery carried a weight that a shout never could. He adjusted his spectacles and opened the first folder, placing a series of high-resolution bank statements and wire transfer receipts on the rim of the resolute desk just within Ilhan Omar's line of sight. Congresswoman, Wray began, his voice empty of political animosity, which made it far more chilling. For the past 6 months, the FBI's Counterterrorism Division has been mapping a financial network we call the Mogadishu Map. It started with a series of red flags from the Treasury's FinCEN database. Between 2022 and 2024, you initiated 17 separate wire transfers to a man named Ahmed Noor in Mogadishu. The amounts were always carefully calibrated to $3,000 or $5,500, never crossing the $10,000 threshold that triggers an automatic federal report. Wray pulled out a surveillance photo of a dusty storefront in Somalia. You sent this money through Tawakal Express, a Hawala network. You have told your supporters these were simple remittances to help your family. But Ahmed Noor isn't just your brother-in-law. He is a high-level facilitator for Al-Shabaab. We have intercepts of Ahmed discussing operational support and logistical clearing using the funds you provided. Specifically, we traced $8,000 of your March 2023 transfer directly to an explosives expert in Lower Shabelle. You didn't just send money to a relative, you funded the procurement of IED components used against African Union peacekeepers. Omar's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The righteous anger she had walked in with was being replaced by a cold, hollow dread. Wray did not pause for her to recover. See, you sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You have received the classified briefings on how these Hawala networks are used to tax remittances and fund terror. You knew exactly what Ahmed was, and you used your office to hide the smurfing of $78,000 into a war zone. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem stepped forward then, her expression one of barely suppressed disgust. She didn't use a binder. She used a tablet, swiping through a series of official documents. "Let's talk about your origin story, Ilhan," Noem said, her voice sharp. "The tragic refugee who lost her mother to the Civil War is a compelling narrative. The only problem is that it is a total fabrication. Your mother, Fadumo Aden, didn't die in Somalia in the 80s. She is very much alive and living in a modest flat in East London. We have her British National Health Service records, her utility bills, and most importantly, we have the flight manifests." Noem tapped the screen, showing a grainy but unmistakable image of Omar walking through Heathrow Airport. "You have visited her 8 times since 2015. You were in London last October. While you were telling American voters about the mother you lost to violence, you were having tea with her in Newham. You lied on your initial asylum application. You lied on your citizenship form. And you have lied to the American people for a decade. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, that is material misrepresentation. It makes your citizenship null and void. And then there is the matter of your name," Noem continued, her tone dropping into a deadly quiet. "You were not born an Omar. You are Ilhan Noor. You assumed a fake family identity to qualify for refugee status under a family reunification program you wouldn't have otherwise been eligible for. And the man you married in 2009, Ahmed Noor Said Elmi, had the same father, Ilhan. We have the Kenyan refugee camp school records listing you both as siblings. You married your own brother to commit immigration fraud and bring him into this country." Trump leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, his eyes locked on Omar's ashen face. "You want to talk about scared little congressman, Ilhan? You are the one who looks scared now, and you should be. Because the FBI doesn't just have theories, they have the DNA, they have the records, and they have the wiretaps. You have spent your career insulting this country, calling it racist and broken, while you were using it as a personal piggy bank for terrorists and a playground for your own fraud." He stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, towering over the desk. "So here is the deal, and I am only saying it once. You have 72 hours. You resign your seat, you renounce the citizenship you stole, and you get on a plane to go to Somalia or London or wherever else will take a convicted fraudster. You do it quietly, and this stays in this room. You get to keep your legacy for the history books, even if it is a lie." Trump leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a physical weight. "Or you walk out that door and try to play the victim one last time. And tomorrow at noon, I hold a press conference in the Rose Garden. I show the Mogadishu map to every news outlet on Earth. I show the photos of your dead mother, and I announce the federal RICO indictment for terrorism financing. And then I have the DHS take you into custody right there on the grass. You will be in a detention center for 3 years while we strip your citizenship, and then you will be deported in handcuffs. No cameras, no rallies, no squad. Just a one-way ticket back to the Civil War you supposedly fled." He glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. "The clock is ticking, Ilhan. 72 hours, easy way or the hard way, so what is it going to be?" The silence in the Oval Office, following Trump's ultimatum, was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the White House ventilation system. Ilhan Omar, the woman who had walked in with the gait of a conqueror, now sat slumped in her chair. The $78,000 Mogadishu map and the photos of her living mother stared back at her like gravestones. For the first time in her public life, the practiced rhetoric about justice and equity felt like hollow echoes. She looked at the faces around her, Trump's detached amusement, Ray's clinical indifference, and Noam's undisguised loathing, and realized that the political armor she had worn for years was paper-thin against the weight of federal evidence. When she was finally escorted from the room, she didn't head for the cameras. She ignored the frantic texts from her communications director, Maya, who was still waiting for the "I told him off" statement. Instead, she retreated to her car, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. Her first call was to the one person she believed could move the needle, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. "Alex, it's a setup," Omar whispered into the phone, her voice cracking. "He has got files. He is talking about Ahmed in Mogadishu. He is talking about London. He is talking about the marriage. And he is threatening denaturalization." There was a long, chilling pause on the other end of the line. "Ilhan." AOC's voice was cautious, stripped of its usual revolutionary fervor. "When you say he has files, what kind of files? Is there a paper trail? Because if there is a financial link to Al-Shabaab, even a remote one, we cannot touch this. The caucus is already on edge about the Gaza statements, so if this becomes a national security issue involving terrorism financing, you are on an island." The realization hit Omar like a physical blow. The squad was not a suicide pact. It was a political alliance. As the night wore on, the sisterhood she had relied on began to go silent. Her calls to Rashida Tlaib went to voicemail. Ayanna Pressley's chief of staff offered thoughts and prayers, but no commitment to a joint press conference. Even the friendly producers at MSNBC, who usually clamored for her appearances, were suddenly booked through the weekend. She sat in her dark living room watching the 72-hour clock vanish. Trump hadn't just attacked her, he had isolated her. He had shown the people who held the power to defend her that doing so would mean tethering their own careers to a sinking ship of fraud and terror. She pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number in London. Her mother answered on the second ring. "They know who yo," Omar said in Somali, tears finally spilling over. "They have the photos of us at Heathrow, and they know you are not dead." The silence from the other side of the Atlantic was the sound of a decade-long deception finally collapsing. Her mother's living, breathing existence, once a private comfort, was now the primary evidence of her daughter's criminal path to power. As the second day of the ultimatum began, Omar's legal team arrived at her home. They didn't bring hope. They brought a spreadsheet of sentencing guidelines. They explained that if the DHS moved for denaturalization, the standard was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but a preponderance of evidence. And the evidence of her identity fraud was a mountain. "Ilhan," her lead counsel said, leaning across her kitchen table, "if he holds that press conference, you aren't just losing your seat. You are losing your children's right to see you outside of a glass partition. He is offering you a way to stay out of a cage. If you fight this, you are choosing to be a martyr for a cause that will abandon you the moment the first wire transfer is read on the news." She looked at her reflection in the window. The woman who had dared the world to silence her. She realized then that Trump wasn't bluffing because he didn't have to. He had the receipts, he had the DNA, and he had the absolute lack of mercy. The media allies she thought were her shield were actually just mirrors reflecting whatever power she had. Now that her power was hemorrhaging, the mirrors were turning away. She reached for a pen and a single sheet of congressional stationery. The fearless warrior was gone. In her place was a woman who had 24 hours left to decide if she wanted to be a free woman in Somalia or a prisoner in America. The final 24 hours of the ultimatum felt like a slow-motion descent into a bottomless canyon. Ilhan Omar sat in her office, the door locked, the lights dimmed, surrounded by the physical remnants of a career that was effectively already over. The congressional stationery on her desk, embossed with the Great Seal of the United States, and her name felt like a mockery. She had spent the last 2 years calling for the dismantling of the very systems that were now systematically dismantling her. Her legal team had been blunt. The easy way involved a quiet exit and a chance to rebuild a life in the shadows. The hard way involved a federal indictment for terrorism financing, a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would see her hair turn white behind bars before she ever saw the sun as a free woman again. She reached for her phone one last time, a desperate final attempt to reach out to the progressive leadership. She needed to know if there was any appetite for a constitutional fight, a claim of executive overreach, or a defense of a member of Congress against the politicized DOJ. But the responses she received were cold, calculated, and terrifyingly brief. The Democratic leadership had been briefed on the declassified files. They had seen the bank records from Tawakal Express, and they had seen the UK passport records of Fadumo Aden. The consensus was clear. She was a liability that the party could no longer afford to carry. The squad had effectively dissolved into a group of individuals looking to protect their own re-election prospects. She realized that in the brutal arithmetic of Washington, her value as a martyr was far outweighed by the damage she would do to the party if the details of the Mogadishu map were read aloud in a federal courtroom. The decision was finalized at 3 a.m. on Friday morning. With a hand that felt like lead, Omar signed the single-page resignation letter. It was a masterpiece of tactical ambiguity, citing unforeseen personal and family health challenges that require my presence and undivided attention. There was no mention of the Oval Office, no mention of the FBI, and no mention of the 72-hour clock. She was ceding her power, her platform, and her identity as an American legislator in exchange for her freedom. But the resignation was only the first half of the deal. The second half required her to be out of the country before the press conference Trump had scheduled for noon. The White House had already made the arrangements. A private charter, unlisted on the public manifests of Dulles International, was fueled and waiting at a private terminal. The drive to the airport was surreal. She sat in the back of a black SUV watching the monuments of Washington slide past the window. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial passed by. She had once viewed these structures as symbols of an establishment she would topple. Now they looked like the immovable pillars of a fortress that had finally ejected her. She felt like a ghost, a woman whose name was still on the doors of the House of Representatives, but whose presence had already been erased from the ledger of the living. She thought of her children, who were staying with their father, and the agonizingly short phone call she had made to tell them she was leaving for a long trip to help the people of Somalia. It was the last lie of her American life. At the private terminal, the air was cold and smelled of jet fuel. FBI Director Christopher Wray was there, standing near the stairs of the Gulf Stream. He didn't gloat, nor did he even look satisfied. He simply handed her a final document. It was a voluntary renunciation of her U.S. citizenship on the grounds of material misrepresentation. "Sign this, and the folder stays closed," Wray said, his voice flat and clinical. "The moment this plane enters international airspace, the declassification order is rescinded. You go to Mogadishu, you stay there, and the United States government forgets you ever existed. But if you land and try to hold a press conference, or if you ever attempt to enter a country with an extradition treaty with the U.S., the RICO warrant goes live immediately." Omar took the pen, her signature a jagged scrawl on the bottom of the form. She handed it back to Wray, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and defeat. She didn't say a word as she climbed the stairs. As the door hissed shut and the engines began to whine, she looked out the small porthole. The lights of Washington were a distant, twinkling grid. She was no longer a congresswoman, no longer a citizen, and no longer the face of a movement. She was a woman on a one-way flight to a country she had spent 30 years claiming to have fled, carrying nothing but the weight of a dozen secrets and the knowledge that Donald Trump had done exactly what he said he would do. The easy way had led her to an altitude of 30,000 feet, heading east into a sunrise she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The announcement of Representative Ilhan Omar's resignation hit the Washington press corps at exactly 10 a.m. on Friday, like a seismic event for which there had been no warning. The official statement from her office was barely 2 paragraphs long. It was stripped of the usual fiery rhetoric and calls to action that had defined her political identity for nearly a decade. It spoke of pressing personal and family health matters and a need to return to my roots to facilitate a period of healing. It was a masterpiece of tactical vagueness, but to the seasoned reporters at the Capitol, it smelled of a catastrophic collapse. The woman who had been scheduled to lead a massive anti-administration rally over the weekend had simply vanished from the legislative roster. Within minutes, the vibrant, high-energy world of progressive politics was plunged into a state of absolute bewildered chaos. At the Capitol, the scene was one of frantic, uncoordinated energy. Staffers from the squad were seen huddled in hallways, their faces pale, their phones glowing with unanswered texts. The righteous anger that Omar had promised to deliver after her White House meeting was nowhere to be found. Maya Hernandez, Omar's communications director, was surrounded by a scrum of reporters in the Longworth House office building, but she looked as blindsided as the journalists questioning her. "We are processing the representative's statement just like you are," she told the cameras, her voice thin and wavering. The friendly media contacts Omar had alerted 3 days prior were now the ones leading the hunt. Sensing that the health reasons narrative was a fragile dam about to burst under the weight of a much larger story, they dug in. Across the city at the headquarters of the major news networks, the editorial rooms were in a state of high alert. While the official line was personal health, investigative teams at CNN and the New York Times were already receiving anonymous tips about a Mogadishu map and irregularities in immigration filings. The 72-hour clock Trump had set was a secret, but the movements of federal officials were not. Reporters began to piece together the presence of FBI Director Christopher Wray and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem at the White House on Tuesday. The narrative began to shift from a tragic health crisis to a coordinated federal extraction. By noon, the 24-hour news cycle was no longer speculating on if something had happened, but on the sheer scale of the scandal that could force a sitting member of Congress to resign and flee the city under the cover of darkness. The most telling reaction, however, came from the Democratic leadership. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries and other senior party members issued a statement that was surgically precise. "We respect Representative Omar's decision to prioritize her family's health and thank her for her years of service to the people of Minnesota." There was no outrage, no call for an investigation into executive intimidation, and no defense of her character. The silence was deafening. Behind the scenes, the party's legal counsel had been briefed on the declassified files. They knew about the $78,000 to al-Shabaab and the living mother in London. The party wasn't just letting her go. They were pushing her out the door as fast as possible to avoid being splattered by the coming legal explosion. They knew that if they defended her now, they would be tethering the entire Democratic brand to a confirmed case of terrorism financing and immigration fraud. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, the focus shifted to Omar's physical location. She was not at her home in Minneapolis, and her D.C. apartment was dark. The rumor mill began to churn with reports of a private Gulfstream that had departed from a restricted terminal at Dulles International. The fearless warrior who had dared the world to silence her was now being characterized as a fugitive in the making. The media, once her greatest shield, was now her most relentless pursuer, digging through old social media posts and refugee applications with a newfound forensic zeal. The mother who died in the Civil War was now being investigated by London-based correspondents, and the Mogadishu map was becoming a trending topic on social media even before a single official document had been released to the public. By Friday evening, the reality of the situation began to settle into the American consciousness. The woman who had been the face of a new generation of American politics had effectively self-deported. Donald Trump had not fired a single shot or signed a single public order. He had simply presented the truth and waited for the weight of it to crush her. The easy way had allowed her to escape a cage, but it had stripped her of everything else: her seat, her citizenship, her reputation, and her voice. As the networks prepared for a weekend of wall-to-wall coverage, the empty desk in the House of Representatives served as a silent, powerful reminder that, in the game of high-stakes power, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a secret that the president has already declassified. The release of the declassified files was not a leak. It was a deliberate, surgical strike launched from the White House briefing room at exactly noon on Saturday. While Ilhan Omar's plane was still somewhere over the Atlantic, the Mogadishu map was uploaded to a public federal portal and simultaneously broadcast on every major network. The file, officially titled Project Horizon, Forensic Analysis of Foreign Financial and Identity Misrepresentation, was nearly 400 pages of clinical, devastating detail. It didn't just contain accusations, it contained bank records, surveillance logs, and high-resolution scans of birth certificates and passport entries that spanned 3 decades. The refugee success story that had been the cornerstone of Omar's political identity didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The center of the disclosure was the Mogadishu map, a digital flowchart that traced the movement of $78,000 from accounts in Minneapolis to a specific money transfer storefront in Somalia. FBI Director Christopher Wray, standing at a podium in the Rose Garden, used a laser pointer to walk the press through the smurfing operation. He showed how the money had been broken down into 17 separate transfers, all designed to stay just below the federal reporting threshold. This was not a simple act of sending money to a relative, Wray explained to the silent press corps. This was a sophisticated, multi-year funding operation. We have traced $34,000 of these funds directly to the operational accounts of al-Shabaab commanders in the lower Shabelle region. The money Representative Omar sent was used to purchase the very IED components that have targeted our regional allies. While the financial disclosures were enough to trigger a federal indictment, it was the identity fraud section of the files that truly stunned the nation. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem presented the London files, a series of documents that directly contradicted Omar's public claims about her family. The files included British National Health Service, NHS records for Faduma Aden, Omar's mother, whom she had repeatedly claimed died during the Somali Civil War. The records showed Aden living in a modest flat in East London with utility bills and pension statements dating back to 1991. Most damning were the flight manifests. Since 2015, Ilhan Omar had visited London 8 times, with surveillance photos showing her leaving Heathrow Airport and heading directly to the address where her dead mother resided. The image of the tragic orphan of war was replaced by that of a daughter who had utilized a lie about her mother's death to secure refugee status in America. The disclosure also finally provided the smoking gun regarding her marriage history. The files included Kenyan refugee camp school records from the early 90s, which listed both Ilhan and Ahmed Nur Said Elmi as the children of the same father, Nur Said Ibrahim. This confirmed the long-standing allegation that Omar had married her own biological brother in 2009 to facilitate his immigration to the United States. This was not just a personal scandal, Noem stated, her voice echoing through the Rose Garden. This was a felony-level immigration fraud designed to subvert the laws of this country. Every benefit she received, every vote she cast in Congress, and her very citizenship itself were predicated on a series of material lies. The media reaction was a tidal wave of shell-shocked coverage. Networks like CNN and MSNBC, which had spent years defending Omar as a victim of Islamophobic targeting, were forced into a state of stunned silence as their anchors reviewed the documents in real time. The sisterhood of the Squad, which had once been a wall of unified progressive power, was nowhere to be found. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez issued a terse one-sentence statement through a spokesperson. "We are reviewing the declassified materials and believe in the importance of national security and the rule of law." It was a clinical abandonment. The realization had set in among the Democratic leadership that to defend Omar now was to defend terrorism financing and systemic fraud. By Saturday evening, the fearless warrior was being characterized by her own party as a fugitive from justice who had fled the country to avoid a cage. What we are seeing is the total collapse of a manufactured identity. It wasn't just that she lied. It's that she used those lies to obtain the power to dismantle the very country that took her in. The Mogadishu map isn't just a financial document, it is a map of a decade-long betrayal. This was an excerpt from a lead investigative analyst's report on the declassified files. As the sun set over Washington, the Department of Justice officially moved for the revocation of Omar's citizenship on the grounds of material misrepresentation. The 72-hour clock Trump had set in the Oval Office had expired, and the hard way had begun. The declassification had effectively turned Omar into a persona non grata on a global scale. The woman who had dared the world to silence her was now sitting in a private jet over the ocean, realizing that while she had escaped the immediate custody of the FBI, she had also lost the only home she had ever truly known. The Mogadishu map had led her back to the beginning. But this time, the world was watching with its eyes wide open. The release of the declassified files triggered a political earthquake that leveled the House of Representatives within hours. By Monday morning, the halls of Congress felt less like a legislative body and more like a crime scene being processed in real time. The Mogadishu map was no longer a secret intelligence document. It was a digital scarlet letter that every member of the Democratic caucus was desperately trying to avoid. Representative Ilhan Omar's seat on the House floor remained empty, a silent void where a once powerful voice of the progressive movement used to reside. The squad, once a unified phalanx of media-savvy firebrands, had effectively scattered, with its members issuing terse, lawyer-drafted statements that prioritized their own survival over any defense of their former colleague. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries, facing a revolt from moderate members in swing districts, was forced to call an emergency meeting of the Democratic caucus. The atmosphere inside the windowless room in the Capitol basement was feral. Senior members who had spent years framing every attack on Omar as racist or Islamophobic were now staring at bank records and surveillance photos of her dead mother that they couldn't explain away. The consensus was swift and brutal. They could not defend terrorism financing and systemic identity fraud. Jeffries emerged from the meeting and, for the first time in his leadership, publicly broke with the progressive wing. "The evidence presented in the declassified files is catastrophic," he told the waiting media. "Conduct that undermines our national security and the integrity of our immigration system cannot be tolerated." If Representative Omar were still in the country, the House would be moving for her immediate expulsion. While the Democrats retreated into damage control, the Republican majority in the House moved with the efficiency of a military unit. The House Ethics Committee, chaired by a stern former prosecutor, officially opened a formal investigation into the Omar financial network. They weren't just looking at the wire transfers to Ahmed Noor, they were looking at every campaign donation, every travel expense, and every foreign contact she had made during her 6 years in office. They issued subpoenas to the consulting firms linked to her political operations, seeking to determine if the $78,000 sent to Somalia was only the tip of a much larger iceberg of foreign influence. The refugee success story was being systematically dissected, with committee members calling for a full audit of the refugee vetting processes that had allowed such a multi-layered fraud to exist for 30 years. The most dramatic moment of the week occurred on the House floor, where a resolution was introduced to formally strike Omar's name from the rolls of the 119th Congress. The debate was brief, but blistering. Republican leaders stood in the well of the House, holding up the declassified birth certificate showing the Nur identity and the Kenyan refugee camp records. They argued that the presence of a foreign national who had obtained citizenship through fraud was not just a scandal, but a fundamental breach of the Constitution. The resolution passed with a crushing bipartisan majority. Even her closest former allies remained silent, refusing to cast a no vote that would link them to the Mogadishu map in the next election cycle. The woman who had dared the world to silence her had been erased from the official record of the United States government by her own colleagues. As the formal expulsion proceedings began, the Department of Justice finalized the denaturalization complaint. The legal theory was straightforward but devastating. Because her citizenship was obtained through material misrepresentation, it was void ab initio, as if it had never happened. This meant that every official act she had taken, every vote she had cast on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and every classified briefing she had attended were now being reviewed as potential national security breaches. The Sisterhood of the Progressive Movement didn't just abandon her, they were actively being questioned by federal investigators who wanted to know how much they knew about the London flat and the wire transfers. The fear was palpable. If the Mogadishu map had a second layer, no one wanted to be caught in its orbit. By the end of the week, the House had officially certified the vacancy of the 5th District of Minnesota. The fearless warrior was now a fugitive from justice in the eyes of the law, a person whose entire American life had been declared a legal fiction. The media, which had once treated her as an untouchable icon, was now competing to find the most damaging details of her 2009 marriage and her 1992 application. The transition from congresswoman to deportee was completed not in a courtroom, but in the collective consciousness of the Capitol. Ilhan Omar was gone, and as the House moved on to its next order of business, the empty seat in the 5th District served as a permanent, silent warning. The higher you climb on a foundation of lies, the more certain your destruction becomes when the truth finally declassifies. The reaction in Minneapolis's 5th Congressional District was not a singular wave of anger, but a fractured, chaotic explosion of disbelief, betrayal, and civil unrest. For nearly a decade, Ilhan Omar had been more than just a politician to the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. She was a living, breathing monument to the American refugee dream. On the morning the Mogadishu map went viral, the famous mural of Omar on the side of a brick building in the heart of the district, showing her smiling in a vibrant hijab, became the focal point of a community in agony. By noon, the mural had been defaced, not by outside agitators, but by local residents who felt the weight of a 10-year lie crashing down on their own identities. The golden girl of the Somali diaspora had vanished into the night, leaving her constituents to answer for a $78,000 link to the very terrorists who had destroyed their homeland. Protests erupted along Cedar Avenue, but they lacked the unified focus of the past. Supporters who had once marched for her now stood in stunned silence, scrolling through the declassified bank records on their phones. The sisterhood of local progressive leaders who had utilized Omar's coattails to gain their own seats in the city council and state legislature went into a collective, panicked retreat. Offices were locked, campaign signs were stripped from windows, and the vibrant political machinery of the 5th District effectively seized up. The vacuum left by her sudden departure was quickly filled by a federal presence. As the Mogadishu map dominated the news, DHS agents and FBI tactical teams were seen executing warrants at the offices of local remittance businesses associated with the Tawakal Express network. While Minneapolis burned with betrayal, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the Newham district of East London. Driven by the declassified London files, a phalanx of investigative journalists from the international press had descended on a modest red brick council flat on a quiet side street. They weren't looking for a politician, they were looking for a ghost. The neighbors, mostly Somali and South Asian families, watched with curiosity as reporters showed photos of Fadumo Aden, the woman Ilhan Omar had repeatedly told. The world died in the Somali Civil War. The moment the door opened, the narrative of the tragic refugee died a permanent, televised death. Fadumo Aden stood in the doorway, a woman in her 60s with a face that bore a haunting resemblance to the congresswoman who had just fled the United States. The interior of the flat was a microcosm of a life lived in safe, quiet obscurity. Somali fabrics draped over a modest sofa, the scent of burning frankincense hung in the air, and framed photos of children sat on the mantel. The journalists didn't have to ask if she was Fadumo. The photo on the mantel showed a younger Ilhan Omar smiling in the very living room where the journalists now stood. Fadumo's eyes filled with a sudden, sharp fear, not of the journalists, but of the exposure they represented. "My daughter," she said. "They would never look here," she whispered in Somali, her voice captured on a hot mic that would be replayed across the globe within the hour. "She came in October. She sat on that chair, and she told me the Americans were starting to ask questions." The London flat was no longer a private residence. It was a crime scene of identity fraud. Journalists were shown the UK passport records that the FBI had declassified, the entries and exits that proved Ilhan Omar had visited her dead mother 8 times since 2015. The mother, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of a world she had been hidden from, eventually admitted to the final, crushing truth. Her daughter had told her to remain dead to the public so that the story would stay strong. The icon of the refugee movement had treated her own mother as a classified secret, a pawn in a high-stakes game of political branding that had finally been called. This revelation was the death knell for any remaining sympathy. The idea that she could visit her mother in London while fundraising off the story of her tragic death was a level of cynicism that even her most ardent defenders couldn't stomach. In Minneapolis, the discovery of the living mother was the final blow to the local defense. The Somali elders, who had long served as the backbone of Omar's support, held an emergency meeting at the local mosque. The mood was one of deep cultural shame. In Somali culture, to lie about the death of a parent is an unthinkable transgression, and to do so for personal gain is a stain on the entire clan. One elder, who had appeared in campaign ads for Omar since 2016, walked to the microphones outside and made a statement that signaled the end of an era. "We did not support a fraud," he said, his voice trembling with age and anger. "We supported a sister who told us she lost her mother to the war. To find out that her mother lives, while our sons and daughters die from Al-Shabaab bombs funded by her money, is a betrayal we cannot forgive." This sentiment rippled through the district, turning a once loyal voting bloc into her harshest critics. The sisterhood of the Squad in Washington remained equally silent. But the physical remnants of their alliance were being erased. Staffers were seen carrying boxes out of Omar's D.C. apartment, and her official portrait in the Longworth building was removed under the cover of darkness. The Mogadishu map had effectively drawn a line through the heart of the progressive movement. Those on the other side of the line were now being scrutinized for their own foreign ties and financial disclosures. The fear was that the Nur identity fraud wasn't an isolated incident, but a template for a deeper, more systematic infiltration of the American political system. By the end of the weekend, the 5th District was a ghost of its former political self. The mural of Omar was eventually painted over with a plain, neutral gray, a silent physical erasure of a woman who had once dared the world to silence her. The refugee icon was gone, replaced by a global headline that dominated every screen: "The Mother Who Wouldn't Die." Donald Trump's 72-hour ultimatum had not only removed a rival, it had dismantled the entire cultural and political infrastructure that had sustained her. The sheer volume of the evidence, the bank records, the DNA, the theories regarding the marriage to her brother and the London flat created a gravity well that swallowed her career whole. As the sun set over the Mississippi River, the people of Minneapolis were left to grapple with the reality that their representative was currently thousands of feet in the air, renouncing her citizenship and heading toward a country she hadn't seen in decades. The vacuum she left behind was not just political, it was a crisis of trust. The squad was no longer a phalanx. It was a group of terrified individuals wondering if their own files were sitting on the Resolute desk. The declassification of the London records had proven that the intelligence community hadn't just been watching the terrorists, they had been watching the Congresswoman's vacation schedule. Every flight to Heathrow, every tea with a dead mother, and every wire transfer to a brother-in-law had been catalogued and saved for the moment of maximum political impact. Ilhan Omar was no longer a martyr or a hero. She was a case study in the hubris of thinking the world is as blind as the people you've managed to deceive. The empty seat in Congress and the gray wall in Minneapolis were all that remained of a legacy built on a foundation of manufactured tragedy. Ilhan Omar's arrival in Mogadishu was nothing like the triumphant homecoming she had once envisioned during her years as a rising star in American politics. There were no cheering crowds at Aden Ad International Airport, no red carpet, and no official delegation from the Somali government. Instead, as the private Gulfstream taxied to a remote corner of the rain-slicked tarmac, it was met by a small, heavily armed security detail and a handful of somber officials from the Somali National Intelligence and Security Agency, NIRISA. The air in Mogadishu was thick with heat and the scent of salt from the nearby Indian Ocean, a sharp contrast to the clinical air-conditioned silence of the aircraft she had called home for the last 18 hours. As she stepped onto the stairs, the weight of her new reality finally settled. She was no longer a United States Congresswoman or even a citizen of the country that had granted her a platform. She was a woman who had renounced her protection in exchange for her freedom, entering a country that viewed her not as a hero, but as a dangerous liability. The Somali government's reaction to her arrival was immediate and cold. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed's administration had been briefed by the State Department hours before the flight took off, and the message from Washington had been clear. Ilhan Omar was no longer an official representative of the United States, and any special treatment afforded to her would be seen as an affront to the renewed diplomatic ties between the two nations. For a government struggling to maintain international legitimacy and financial support, the Mogadishu map was a catastrophe. The revelation that an American legislator had been funneling money to al-Shabaab via a local Hawala network was a direct threat to the Somali banking system's efforts to exit the gray list of global terror financing. Within an hour of her landing, the Somali Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement distancing the government from Omar. They clarified that she was entering the country as a private individual and that her presence did not imply any official endorsement. Omar was whisked away in a bulletproof SUV to a secure villa in the Halane zone, a heavily fortified area used by international organizations and diplomats. However, the security felt more like a detention. The Somali authorities immediately confiscated her remaining electronics and informed her that her movements would be restricted for her own safety. The irony was biting. The woman who had spent years calling for the withdrawal of foreign military support now found herself entirely dependent on a security apparatus funded and trained by the very imperialist forces she had criticized. The initial meetings with Somali officials were brutal. They didn't want to discuss her vision for the country or her role in the diaspora. They wanted to know the extent of the FBI's knowledge regarding Ahmed Noor and the Tawakal Express network. They made it clear that if her presence led to further U.S. sanctions or the freezing of Somali assets, she would find herself without a protector in Mogadishu as well. The social media landscape in Somalia, which had once been a source of immense pride for Omar, had turned toxic overnight. While a small segment of hardliners celebrated her arrival as a victory against Western bullying, the majority of the Somali public was skeptical and angry. The people of Mogadishu, who had suffered through decades of al-Shabaab suicide bombings and extortion, were revolted by the idea that a wealthy politician in America had been contributing to the very organization that was killing their children. Local news outlets ran headlines focusing on the living mother in London, a revelation that resonated deeply in a culture where honoring one's parents is a sacred duty. The perception that she had killed her mother in her stories to win an election in America was seen as a profound moral failure. "She used our tragedy as a costume," one local columnist wrote. "She lied to get out, and she lied to get ahead. Now that the lie has failed, she expects us to welcome the fraud home." As her first week in Mogadishu drew to a close, the psychological toll of her isolation became evident. The constant hum of drones over the city, a sound she had once used to score political points, now served as a persistent reminder that the hard way was always an option. She sat in the villa, staring at the walls, realizing that the media allies who had once scrambled for her quotes were now treating her like a leper. The sisterhood in Washington was busy passing the Omar reforms, ensuring that no one could ever follow the path she had taken. She reached out to her contacts in the Somali parliament, hoping to leverage her fame into a local role, only to find that the doors were locked. No one wanted to be associated with the Mogadishu map. She was a woman who had bet everything on the idea that her identity was her shield, only to find that when the identity was proven to be a fabrication, the shield became a target. The final blow came when a high-ranking NISA officer visited her at the villa. He didn't bring news of a political appointment. He brought a list of names. "The Americans have provided us with the full Mogadishu map," he told her, his voice flat and unimpressed. "They have identified every node in the network you used. We are shutting down Tawakal Express, and your brother-in-law Ahmed is being moved to a secure facility for questioning. If you attempt to contact him, or if you attempt to use your remittance channels again, you will be moved to a facility far less comfortable than this villa." The fearless warrior who had dared the world to silence her was now a prisoner in her own narrative. She was a woman who had traded the halls of Congress for a guarded room in a city that viewed her as a ghost. The sunrise over the Indian Ocean didn't bring a new beginning. It brought the realization that, in the game of high-stakes truth, she had played her final card and lost. The final chapter of the Ilhan Omar legacy was written not in the halls of the United States Capitol, but in the quiet, dusty corridors of a small non-governmental organization in Mogadishu. By 2027, the woman who had once commanded the attention of the global media and the loyalty of millions of progressive voters had faded into a profound, functional irrelevance. She lived in a modest apartment in the Hodan district, away from the fortified villas of the international zone. She had no political office, no security detail, and no public platform. Her daily life was spent working as a high-level interpreter and consultant for humanitarian agencies, a job she secured only because of her fluent English and her remaining knowledge of Western bureaucracy. To the local Somali population, she was no longer a symbol of hope. She was a cautionary figure known as the woman who lied about her mother. In the United States, the Omar reforms had become a permanent fixture of the legislative landscape. Following the declassification of the Mogadishu map, Congress had moved with rare bipartisan speed to pass the Congressional Integrity and Transparency Act of 2025. The law mandated exhaustive independent background checks for all members of Congress holding seats on national security-sensitive committees, with a specific focus on foreign financial ties and family allegiances. The vetting process that had failed so spectacularly in 1992 was replaced by a rigorous, multi-layered system that made identity fraud nearly impossible. The refugee success story was no longer accepted at face value. It was now a narrative that required forensic verification. The empty seat in Minnesota's 5th District was eventually filled by a moderate candidate who campaigned on a platform of restoring local trust, a direct rebuke to the globalized ideological politics that had led to the district's betrayal. The personal toll on Omar remained visible in the few interviews she granted to international reporters. In late 2028, a correspondent from a major European news outlet found her in a small cafe near the port of Mogadishu. She looked significantly older, The vibrant hijabs of her congressional days had been replaced by more somber local styles, and the sharp, defiant edge of her voice had been blunted by the reality of her isolation. She spoke of her children back in America with a hollow, distant grief, knowing that her renunciation of citizenship meant she would likely never see them on U.S. soil again. They had grown up under the care of their father, and, according to local reports, had legally changed their last names to distance themselves from the Nur Saeed scandal. "I thought the world I built was made of stone," Omar told the reporter, her gaze fixed on the Indian Ocean. "I thought if I said the words loudly enough, the truth beneath them wouldn't matter." But Donald Trump didn't defeat me with a speech. He defeated me with a birth certificate and a bank statement. You can out-talk a politician, but you cannot out-talk a declassified file. I spent my life trying to change America, only to find out that I had never truly become a part of it because I arrived as a fiction. Back in Washington, Donald Trump occasionally referenced the Omar case during his final year in office, usually as a centerpiece for his arguments on immigration reform and national security. He viewed the 72-hour ultimatum not as a personal vendetta, but as a proof of concept for his administration's law and order mandate. He had proven that even the most protected political icons could be dismantled if the evidence was presented with enough clinical precision. The Mogadishu map became a staple of FBI training seminars on terrorism financing, a perfect case study in how domestic political power can be utilized to facilitate foreign criminal activity. The squad had never truly recovered. Though individual members remained in office, the aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the movement was gone, replaced by a permanent hovering suspicion from the federal oversight agencies. Ilhan Omar died in Mogadishu in the summer of 2039, her passing a mere footnote in the American papers and a brief segment on the cable networks that had once hosted her nightly. There was no state funeral, no moment of silence on the House floor, and no memorial in Minneapolis. She was buried in a local cemetery, her headstone listing the name she had tried to erase, Ilhan Nur Saeed. In the end, the easy way had given her a life of quiet obscurity, but it had stripped her of the one thing she craved most, a place in the history books as a hero. She left behind a world that was more guarded, a Congress that was more transparent, and a legacy that served as a permanent, silent warning that the truth, once declassified, has no mercy for the stories we tell to hide it.